Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Amanda and Adam, for the kind words and the introduction. I would like to very quickly thank the team, my colleagues with the Ismism Collaborative Research Group. It's been fascinating 2-3 years together. Jesse Lerner, Luciano, Brenda, Winona. It's a fantastic team. I've been really blessed to work with everyone. For the sake of time, I will just briefly introduce tonight's program. And I think it's very important that I say very quickly that I am looking at this material as an anthropologist and as someone who's really wrestling with this discipline we call anthropology. And anthropology, as the title of this show indicates, is connected here with the work of Raúl Ruiz. And I will explain why I think Raúl Ruiz makes anthropology tremble, or the kind of images that anthropology has been producing over the past, let's say, 150 years tremble. I will read you a very beautiful passage from Raúl Ruiz's definition of the trembling image. So, now let's make the effort of imagining a cinema which can reflect such a world. We can conceive a certain type of filming capable of treating each segment of the world and the object it contains case by case. So there's a beautiful casuistic almost approach in his work, case by case, very clinical. Capable as well of letting us travel to the confines of creation through the simple juxtaposition of a small number of trembling images. So Raúl Ruiz, Anthropology's Trembling Images. If you are familiar with the history of ethnographic cinema or the intersection between anthropology and film, you will find tonight, I hope, an unusual relationship of Raúl Ruiz to that particular tradition, a tradition that I don't think Raúl Ruiz belongs to. So he's not an ethnographic filmmaker, he is not a filmmaker who makes films as an anthropologist, yet he does something with anthropology which he refers to on various occasions in his films, either by staging a character that is an anthropologist or by shooting a beautiful procession of Mapuches going to attend a speech by Salvador Allende in 1971. But you never learn about the cultures of these people in Raúl Ruiz's films. There is something enigmatic. Anthropology is no longer the discipline that teaches us about cultural difference or cultural diversity. It makes that whole vocation of anthropology turns upside down. But he does it at the same time with a deep and intimate understanding of the communities, of the characters that he stages. So they are very interesting films, as you will see tonight. There's, in his definition of the word trembling image, he uses the word creation. If you do remember John Grierson's definition of documentary is the creative treatment of reality. So there is something of the order of documentary film and of experimental documentary in Raúl Ruiz's films. There's also a dimension of experimental narrative cinema. And the films that you will see tonight, short films, rather little-known films of Raúl Ruiz's immense oeuvre. He made about 100 films. And I think that Raúl Ruiz can be, his career can be divided into 3 periods, roughly. The Chilean period, the films that he made from the early 1960s all the way to the coup d'etat in 1973. During that period, he served as a consultant to the Salvador Allende coalition. He made one of his most important films, an experimental narrative, Tres Tigres Tristes. And he made some films also that were meant to really give a sense of how Salvador Allende's revolution was a revolution sin armas, or a revolution almost without blood, but obviously history proved everyone wrong. So there is this very interesting way of listening to a revolutionary process that make him stand apart from the kind of militant political filmmakers that were making films in the 1960s. Certainly some of his fellow Chilean filmmakers, filmmakers from the period, but also neighboring Argentinian Solanas, for example, and The Hour of the Furnaces. So for me, Raúl Ruiz is this interesting figure between political cinema, about which I won't be talking, and ethnographic film. So what kind of difference is generated through the films of Raúl Ruiz? The second period is the period that is of interest to me. It's the period after he leaves forcefully. He just happens to be making a film in Honduras with a team of the German television, if I remember correctly. So he escapes the dictatorship moment, and then he moves to Paris, where he becomes an exile and makes a series of interesting films, and he gets inserted into the intellectual community, the Parisian intellectual community, and he starts befriending philosophers such as Klossowski, for example, with which he will collaborate. One of the great films that came out of that collaboration is the Hypothesis of a Stolen Painting, which I highly recommend. During that period, he also, I think, starts making a critique of a certain kind of documentary filmmaking. I think he takes a gentle pun at Chris Marker's essayistic style on some occasions. I think if you pay close attention of great events and ordinary people, you will find that Raúl Ruiz is an easy boat with narrative filmmaking and experimental documentary filmmaking, and really searching for his own a way of giving form to the kind of trembling images that he is theorizing in his own work. I should also add that Raúl Ruiz belongs to that really kind of privileged community of film artists who are also theorists, but who are also theorists as book writers, as essay writers. The Poetics of Cinema, Volume 1 and Volume 2 are just wonderful texts, and I highly recommend, in particular, 2 chapters of The Poetics of Cinema, Images, The Image of Images, and The Photographic and Conscious. In one of those essays in particular, he continues to explore his interest in philosophy, medieval philosophy. He has a particular interest in Ramon Rull and his combinatorial logics. He's interested also in Ibn Arabi, one of the mystical philosophers of 12th century Andalusia. And he's interested in Nietzsche. He's very much interested in Nietzsche, like Klossowski was. Klossowski is one of the foremost experts and writer on Nietzsche. He's also interested in Aby Warburg, the art historian whom some of us in anthropology consider as the quote-unquote pioneer and father of the field of the anthropology of images. And he's interested in Warburg in particular, and in the Warburg Institute in particular, the Warburg Library, because it's a library that does not have originals. It has only copies. And it has only copies that are juxtaposed to one another through a very interesting mixture of Baroque aesthetics that really cultivates the value of excess, but also it has a very particular interest in deploying an aesthetics that turns that interest and that passion for excess into a collapse of the very notion of identity itself. So Raúl Ruiz is a very interesting cine-philosopher, if you will, who brings together all of these different references. So we cannot separate the trembling images of Raúl Ruiz, who really kind of shakes the ground of anthropology as the discipline that cultivates cultural difference, with this almost anti-original aspect of his filmmaking practice. And this is the aspect of his work that I find particularly fascinating. Then comes the third period that we associate with his, let's say, high-budget films, right? Time Regained, Klimt with John Malkovich, and then tens of other films that he made thanks to a budget that allowed him to make those kind of films. So out of these 3 periods, of course, they are in constant communication with one another. I found the second period of particular interest to me. So when one thinks about the history of ethnographic cinema, or the intersection between anthropology and film in Latin America, in this region we call Latin America, one thinks, of course, I mean, this is the context that I am quite familiar with, the Mexican context. So we are familiar with Queriba Mexico, for example, Eisenstein's ode or symphony to the Mexican Revolution. You might argue whether that film is an ethnographic film or not, but nonetheless, there is an interest in linking the pre-Columbian fragments that constitute modern Mexico into a very interesting montage that then becomes at the service of the revolution. You can think also of the Venezuelan film Araya, which is a beautiful film, highly modernist, purist almost in its style, that foregrounds and stages salt extraction workers in the Salinas, in a particular region of Venezuela. And there are other films that you can think about. But unlike this particular tradition, where there is a particular subject matter, where there is a people, what we would call ethnos in anthropology, the trembling images of Raúl Ruiz are released from representation. They're released from identity, and they do something quite interesting. They're also highly personal films. They are almost autoethnographic films. Tonight, I thought that it would be interesting to pair some of these rarely seen films, at least in a theatrical setting, with the work of two Brazilian filmmakers, one of whom Raúl Ruiz had a particular friendship with, Artur Omar. And then, of course, Anna Maria Maiolino, whose exhibition is now ongoing here. Why did I pair him with two Brazilians? Well, first, again, as an anthropologist, I think that they are the two great anthropological traditions in Latin America are the Mexican and the Brazilian. In fact, if I spoke Portuguese, I would probably, go and study the intersections between anthropology and contemporary art and film in Brazil. But Brazil, of course, is known for its movement Anthropophagia that really developed this anthropological theory of cultural cannibalism. And I think that, to a certain extent, Raúl Ruiz is a cultural cannibalist, but I think he's even more radical than his friends from Brazil. But he does it in a very interesting way. Artur Omar's Libro do Raúl is a meditation on their friendship and on the state of filmmaking in their respective countries. It's a travelogue. It's a dialogue via images. Artur Omar is known for Triste Trópico. Triste Tropique is the title of an important book by Lévi-Strauss, 1955. And the first pages of that book are now quite almost raised to the status of a monument. I hate traveling and travelers, right? Triste Trópico, Artur Omar's films, it would be nice to see him, perhaps we can do that at some other moment, is an 80-minute meditation of a character who returned from France after studying medicine and becomes a shaman upon his return to Brazil. There's also a little nod that Caetano Veloso does later in his beautiful song The Stranger, where Veloso makes fun of Lévi-Strauss, who not only hated travelers and travel, but also referred to the pine cone in Rio as a tooth with a cavity. So there are all of these very interesting references that get mixed. And Anna Maiolino, obviously the title is a direct reference to Anthropophagia and Osvaldo de Andrade, and the movement of a mouth that ingurgitates and unidentified material is something that I find appealing. So it's curated in such a way that we bring the intersection of anthropology and avant-garde cinema together. I think that anthropology is an avant-garde and modernist discipline. But Raúl Ruiz does something very different from those experimental filmmakers who frontally engage anthropology. He's really inventing a new point of view, and this is something that I argue in the essay that's in the book that Adam just showed you. So, to make a long story short, I think we can talk about this during the Q&A, but I think it would be very interesting for you to pay attention in particular at how the landscape, the urban landscape in particular, is a mise en scène of a time that has been lost and that needs to be regained through a particular kind of narrative. There are always very interesting voiceover narrations in the film, almost in the time travel tradition. There are echoes of La Jetée, for example, in some of these films. I think one of my favorite films tonight of this program is El regreso de un ratón de biblioteca, The Return of a Library Lover, which to me is a film that needs to be read in relationship to Jorge Luis Borges' beautiful two-page short story El Ethnographo, translated at times as the ethnographer, translated at times as the anthropologist. We won't get into those battles. But in Borges, what's very interesting in that story is that the return of the anthropologist from the field is a return in which a mutation and a transformation takes place. The anthropologist gets a divorce, abandons academia, and becomes a librarian. And I think that to see Raúl Ruiz's films, and the films from tonight's program in particular, as that which makes anthropology tremble by inventing a new kind of form of image, a type of image, I think reminds us that Raúl Ruiz belongs to this tradition of intersections between anthropology and cinema, and avant-garde cinema in particular. But I think he hijacks it and takes it into a completely different direction. And so I hope you enjoy the program, and I'm happy to take some questions at the end. Yes?
So, quick question. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the Mailino film and how it fits in the first film we watched. Say a little bit more about how it fits in with the other films.
So the Mailino film, to me, functions as a signifier of tension and love affair between avant-garde arts and experimental anthropology. I think if you noticed in some of the Ruiz's films, the word hombre in the existential philosophical sense of the term is used quite often, right? So for me, that particular Super 8mm film, right, by Mailino, then transferred into video, plays that function. I mean, curatorially it plays the function of something of the order of the human, but a human that is deformed. But it also reference to, if you want to insist on the relationship between political history and the type of image, it invokes, of course, questions of censorship under dictatorship. The mouth that's covered. But then also I like the idea of what do filmmakers like Raúl Ruiz do with something that invokes the prefix anthropos. I'm interested in that, or the hombre, or the human. And I think also that Raúl Ruiz has a relationship with Brazil, which he talks about, in quite amusing ways in Arturo Omar's film. In fact, it's almost a co-authored film. And I also like the and I also
yeah, it's on.
It's on. So and I also, if you take a quick look at the show here, which is really beautiful, this idea of mapas mentales, mental maps, is something that I am very much interested in. And I think that Raúl Ruiz, in this sense, belonged to that particular tradition of artists that play with interior psychological maps. But also there is a tension between, Mailino is often referred to as someone who kind of emerged during the kind of the apex of the neo-concreto movement, right, as a response to concrete art. And I like the fact that Raúl Ruiz is both a highly abstract and mental artist, at the same time an artist who relies on phenomenological kind of the quality of lived experience itself. So the Brazilians in this program function both at the level of personal friendships, in the case of Arturo Omar, and in the case of Mailino, all of this philosophical anthropophagus. And also to put Raúl Ruiz with his cultural cannibal friends. And although he's of a different kind, he's a different kind of cultural cannibal, I think he's even more extreme than them. I'm not creating a hierarchy, I'm just saying that I think he intensifies that disintegration of our capacity to recognize where things come from. But there are a lot of contradictions at the same time, because he's obsessed with Chile. So I don't know if that answers the question.
talk a little bit about the context in which the last film was made? Because again, you have the dictatorship in the background and the sense of doing, returning to do the ethnography, but viewed from afar, and then it becomes this sort of absurdist exercise of Egyptian pyramids.
So I think I would even say that Raúl Ruiz is ironic. I think he has a humor, which is, I don't think they're the same thing, but we don't have to get into that. But he's ironic because he knows the references and he's manipulating them in quite specific ways. So irony requires a deep language of the cultural context. Humor is something that I think happens in a moment in the film where his librarian friend just starts speaking in tongue and things get completely mixed up, right? And it just stops making sense. So I would assume that Raúl Ruiz, who has been completely and warmly welcomed by the Parisian intellectual scene, which is composed of North Africans, and there are a couple of North Africans, Tunisian intellectuals who appear in the film Toucan, for example. I would assume that there is something of the order of exile that he had already explored in films such as Le Dialogue des Exilés, or the Dialogue of the Exiles, with a certain kind of desire to return to his homeland that he at times described almost like a classical anthropologist. I mean, there is kind of this sense of national character that he examines, right? But I think the absurdity of putting all of these differences, all of these references together is what makes the film appealing, because we have Mayans, we have Egyptians, we have also a kind of analogical form of logic. So you have the Cordillera that becomes the Great Wall of China, but then becomes an Egyptian pyramid, and he repeats an Egyptian pyramid, so it's not a Mayan pyramid, for example, while there are references to the Mayas. What I find interesting in Ruiz and the context that you're talking about has to do with a disintegration of any kind of search of identity, but at the same time there is this kind of obsession with El País Natal. And this relationship to the native land, or almost this kind of this illness, this pathology that is that he talks about in his conversation with Arthur Omar, is never resolved in this particular film. He has been returning to Chile quite often. He is quite attached to Chile. And he is very clear that some of his films are to be read as personal films, if not autoethnographic films. So I would say that it's almost an excess of, there's a moment where he talks about this character who inhabits multiple worlds, right? Almost as if there were various sheets of time that this character is embedded in. I think, to answer your question, Raúl Ruiz has always been returning. And he has always been returning not only because he has been forced to leave his country, but as a socialist, as a particular kind of socialist, that he connected with the left bank intellectuals, the leftists of Paris. A Paris that was also kind of nourished from migrants from the former colonies, the Maghreb in particular, but also sub-Saharan Africa, Senegal, etc. So there is a community also exiled from Chile who are living in Paris and who often are the actors who perform in his work. So that's one way of answering your question. But I think the key to that question is the title of a book by Klosowski that he refers to in his conversation with Arthur Omar, is the notion of the vicious circle. So I think Chile and Paris function as the vicious circle for him. It's the loop, it's the missing fragment, it's the installation within the film itself, right? So you could install, in fact, these films as installation, as looped films in an installation. It would be interesting to think about an exhibition around these films, using them as installation material. So, and I don't know if some of you had this. I mean, I'm not from Chile. I'm from Morocco. So, I cannot say that I know Chilean culture. But every time he was talking about Chile, it sounded like Morocco. So it sounded about that kind of this illness that he diagnoses, right? The hatred for one's country. I guess we all have that. But he manages to do something interesting with it.
Yes, really great to hear you talk about this. I'm curious about something you said at the beginning, which was how some of the work you read as a critique of Chris Marker.
Mm-hmm.
And after seeing this and thinking about Raúl Ruiz making films very, very provisionally, say in New York in 1990 with the Golden Boat or in Paris, we really see the sort of contingency, and also
could you say that again? I couldn't.
One really sees the contingency. And the methodology in which he puts together something. So I just want to really hear you talk a little bit more about the critique of Marker.
Mm-hmm. So I think the critique of Marker, implicit and explicit in the documentary film, or the strange documentary film of great events and ordinary people, I think can be located within a debate about the status of the voiceover and the status of narration in non-narrative cinema. Chris Marker is clearly has a vast oeuvre, as does Raúl Ruiz, so they belong to the same Parisian milieu. And at the same time, you know that Chris Marker had made a film called The Ambassadors, during the coup d'etat, right, in 1973. So Chris Marker has tried to make a film in Mexico, which never materialized, but you can find it in his 2-volume books, Commentaires. It's called Soy Mexico, which echoes Que Viva Mexico. So Chris Marker has a relationship, because of his tricontinentalism, because of his internationalist politics, has a relationship with with Latin America and the Americas in general. So, but the critique that I was talking about had more to do with really questions of documentary film form. It seems to me that there are two different filmmakers. They're two different filmmakers, but at the same time, there is a melancholic tone that you can, I think, tease out in certainly in Chris Marker's films. There is the question of the relationship to Lévi-Strauss and to the particular kind of essayistic voiceover. More pronounced, certainly, in Chris Marker. But I think the question of the time traveler, I think, is what binds them.
Yeah,
so I don't know if you noticed that La Jetée and this last film have...
Well, and one can also think about, especially in something like The Ambassadors, there's a fantasy of totality, which you only get the payoff at the end at Paris.
Yeah, that's right, yes.
So in a sense, I guess what I'm saying about this idea of contingency and Raúl Ruiz working in different contexts is that he's always working with whatever he finds, which I think is certainly echoed in both the use of the first person pronoun in these films, where the self falls apart, as the narration. But also in terms of how things just cannot ever hold together in the way that Marker, even in his most, sort of euphorically miasmic, narrations, does give you this idea of a thing.
He's a total artist.
There's a sense, there's a fantasy of plenitude in the prose, in the editing, etc., etc.
Yes. We can go on more about this. Thank you for the question.
So actually we have to wrap up here due to time, but I want to thank you very much for sharing.